Hey Beacon, welcome home to your Bounce Back Blueprint Community podcast, where you are challenged to be, do, and have God's best as you thrive on your journey from setback to success. I'm your Bounce Back guide, Tiffany Huff Struthers, and I'll be guiding you on the journey by sharing tips, tools, and the tea on how I was able to bounce back from escaping death, healing from heartbreak, and finding hope in homelessness. And then I wrote an award-winning book all about it. And shout out to God, ever since I was courageous enough to share my story, my life and the lives of women around the world have been forever changed. And as a member of the Bounce Back Blueprint community, I'm called to teach you to do the same. So grab your journal and let's build this blueprint. Hey Beacon, before we start building the blueprint this week, I need to let you know that this week's episode is being brought to you by the P.O.W.E.R Morning. The P.O.W.E.R Morning is a 21-day experience specifically for beacons, women of faith like you who are tired of living in the frustrations of your setback and ready to do the work necessary to bounce back from the moment you wake up. The P.O.W.E.R Morning is all about commanding your morning because your mornings become your days and your days make up your life. What you can look forward to is covenant connections with an intimate group of like-minded women of faith who are also on the bounce back journey, a safe space to gain clarity, build the courage, and your relationship with God as you commit to your calling. An hour of power every single morning for 21 days, a guided workbook, prayers, meditations, journal prompts, and so much more. And the next live session of the P.O.W.E.R Morning kicks off on Monday, August 3rd. You can get all of the tea and details about becoming a part of the next cohort by going to the link in the show notes, tiffanyhuffexperience.com/power. Now, let's get to building the blueprint. You know I want to share a review with you, right? This week's review is from I Am Ro Thomas. And she says, so good. Tiffany is like that friend who calls you on your stuff and gets you together with love when you're being slack. This podcast is such a blessing. You know what else is a blessing? These reviews, not only for me, but for beacons just like you. If you haven't already, please take a moment wherever you're listening, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, leave a review, leave a rating, because it helps other beacons on the journey find the podcast so they can be blessed as well. Now, this week on the podcast, I am really spilling some tea about my morning ritual and how it has changed my life. Grab your journal. You are not going to want to miss these nuggets if you have not grabbed it already. If you need to hit pause while you go grab your journal, do that, sis. You do not want to miss this. So I want to take you back a little bit to when I was knee deep in my setback. And I'm going to give you the abbreviated version of this story that got me knee deep into the setback. And I will continue to share about this story in the episodes to come. So, following a very tumultuous relationship with the father of my children, I actually ended up being shot and in a homeless shelter, and in a domestic violence emergency shelter, right? So I was in this shelter and I was like at the lowest point of my life at this time. I had been shot in my leg and the bullet shattered my femur. So at this time, I initially was in a wheelchair and then I had a walker. Just to give you perspective, I was 25 at this time, so I was in a wheelchair, on a walker, and then for an extended period of time, I was on crutches. When I got to the shelter, their preference was that I use the wheelchair. And the reason why they had that preference was because I was not in the shelter alone. I also had two very small children. So at the time, my oldest son was maybe 2.5, and my youngest son was just shy of his first birthday. So he and I were in essence learning to walk together. And Of course, if you want the down and out on this story on my journey, you can grab my book, 30 Day Stay. I'll make sure the link to purchase the book is in the show notes. So I'm in this shelter. I have two children. My baby and I are both on a journey to learn to walk again. And as you can imagine, my life had been turned upside down. I ended up in this homeless shelter because, like I said, this was following a huge blow up of the relationship between myself and the father of my children. At which point he broke into my house and shot me. And so we had been together for nearly a decade by this point. And after I got out of the hospital, I just didn't feel safe anywhere because he hadn't been apprehended yet. So, and ultimately, my landlord did not evict me, but he did ask me to leave his property following the incident. So I really felt like there was nowhere for me to go. And I had a lot of shame associated with what I was experiencing. And I also did not want to put my family members in danger. It was just a lot of emotion, a lot going on. And so I found myself in this emergency domestic violence shelter where my children and I shared a room and a bathroom. And in this room, I slept on a twin bed. My older son had a toddler bed, and my younger son was in a crib. So this was reducing our life in a 3-bedroom home where we could come and go as we please, and I could walk and function, quote unquote, normally into one room in a shelter with almost 100 strangers, where I was restricted on where and how I came and went and who knew where I was. And also, again, I was dealing with this shame and just uncertain about how I was even going to pick my life back up with everything being such a complete and utter mess. All the while, knowing that my children had front row seats to my ability or lack thereof to bounce back from this experience, right? And so what I can recall is that there would be plenty of mornings when I would wake up very early, even before my children. And if you are a mother of toddlers, then more than likely, you know, they wake up very, very early. So I would be waking up and it would still be dark. And I would literally wake up crying. I would wake up and cry. And then I would pray. And believe it or not, the prayer is really what started the transformation. Because, like I said, I was in such a low place. There were so many things I felt like I needed to do that I could not do. I was dealing with shame. I was dealing with embarrassment. I was dealing with uncertainty. And I was dealing with the physical healing that was necessary for me to even be able to function at 100% capacity, right? And so I was just distraught. I was pretty anxious, but I always had a prayer life. And of course, you know that more often than not, when we get into a place where there's nothing else for us to do, we pray, right? So my morning ritual started in this season with me crying and then with me praying and praying and praying. And the reason why I was so consistent with waking up and praying was because I knew that there was so much more to my life than the situation I was in. I knew that God had a calling on my life. I knew that my children weren't supposed to grow, or that this wasn't the end of the story for myself or for my children, right? And one of the scriptures that I had grabbed hold of at a very early age. One of the scriptures that my father had always impressed upon me was Jeremiah 1:5, right? And so I knew that God had plans to prosper me, right? That he had a hope for my future. And so I clung to that. And when I would cry, I would remember that truth, that scripture, and then I would begin to pray. And I would pray to God about how his word said that, he didn't want to see me in sorrow or in pain, right? And so through the process of me crying and constantly praying, then I started to find peace, right? I started to have peace first thing in the morning because I was diligent in my prayers and I was holding so fast to the truth of Jeremiah 1:5. And then because I'm a natural writer, because I've always written, I would go from crying to praying to writing. And so I would journal. And I remember having this legal pad because that's what they gave me at the shelter. And of course, I didn't have all of my own personal belongings. I literally went there with my children and like a couple of Kmart bags. Um, so they gave me this legal pad, and I was using the legal pad to journal and write through my feelings and my emotions. And it is also that legal pad that I used to start planting the seeds for the book 30 Day Stay. But what happened as I continued to wake up and pray and write is that I really began to understand that even though I had so many things that I felt like I needed, and even though I felt like there were so many things that I needed to do, and I was prioritizing those things because I felt like those things were needed for me to have peace. In this process, though, as I was waking up every morning and crying out to God and praying and writing, I found that the peace of God was the missing piece. I found that, the truth of Philippians 4:7, that God can give you a peace that surpasses all understanding, was the missing piece. I needed that piece in order to be able to do what was necessary to get all of those other things I had on this list about finding somewhere to live and healing myself properly and caring for my children and the desire that I had to still give my son a first birthday party and celebrate his life. So in this process, my morning ritual at that time, which wasn't the full power, it was, I guess, the POW, right? The prayer and the writing. It really started to shift the perspective about my life. It was the foundation for me being able to get my mojo back, right? For me to have a launch pad to find the strength to do what I needed to do because, like I said, there was a lot of shame in this season. And while I had support, because I was always strong Tiff, I was always the one who had the answer. I was more often the one that everybody else depended on. I retreated. I shrank down. I didn't ask for much help. And so most of the help I was asking from was coming from God, right? Once I got that peace, which was the missing piece, I was able and more comfortable to see what I needed to ask for, and I had the discernment to know who to ask. So, in the first part of my bounce back journey, my morning ritual changed my life because it taught me to prioritize peace. Now, fast forward several years, and again, like I said, I will go back and give you the down and dirty of my journey over the next few episodes. That happened in 2006, right? So in 2016, my father passed away. Another setback, right? And my father was my very best friend. When people ask me if I believe in love at first sight, I always say yes, because my father is the first man that I've ever seen, and I do not remember there ever being a time when I did not love my father. So it was absolutely love at first sight. And so he died in 2016, and for about a year and a half leading up to his death, I took care of him. He came to visit my sons and I at the time. Excuse me. He lived in North Carolina. My boys and I were living in Pennsylvania. And he would come up to visit us every October because that's when his birthday was. And he was retired. So he would spend the month of October with us. And then just as it started to get cold in Pittsburgh, he would head back to North Carolina. And so he came to visit in October of 2014 for his birthday, and he started tripping, and there was nothing on the floor. He was kind of tripping over nothing. And so one day I came home and he said, I need you to take me to the emergency room. Something's going on. Like my equilibrium is off. And at the time, the both of us laughed at it, those, oh, Dad, you're getting old kind of jokes. So I took him to the emergency room. He told me he would be fine. He didn't want me to stay with him. And they ended up keeping him over the weekend. And when I went to pick him up to bring him home, he had a walker. And before the end of October, before it was time for him to go back to North Carolina, he was more and more dependent upon the walker. And so we made the decision that he wouldn't go back to North Carolina. He needed to stay here with the boys and I. And by the beginning of January 2015, he was pretty much bedbound. And so I spent the most of 2015 watching my father die. And as you can imagine, it was a very challenging time, a very traumatic time, but because of God's grace, it was also a time where I just had an immense amount of time for my father to pour into me, for him to remind me of who I am and whose I am, and for him to really minister to me in ways that you and other members of this community are reaping the benefits of the seeds he planted. And it hurts me a lot that he isn't here to see the harvest, but prayerfully he is looking down and proud. But following his death, I went into a deep, deep depression. I started having panic attacks just before he passed away. And like I said, after he died, even though I was a witness to the digression in his health, right, and his progression closer to going on into glory, I was not prepared. I was not prepared for what life would be like without him. And so I went into a really dark place. But even in this place, God was calling me. God was stretching me. God was, trying to remind me of the same things my dad was trying to remind me of. And that is who I am and whose I am, and that I had a calling on my life. And so what started to happen, very similar to the experience that I had in the shelter, is that I was waking up very early in the morning. Now, in the shelter, it wasn't this early, but after my dad died, I was having an experience where God was waking me up at 3:30, 4:30 in the morning, and I would literally be in the bed kicking and screaming about my desire to go to sleep. Like, I would be like, please, Lord, I'm so tired. I don't understand. Very similar experience to me crying out, right? And after it was consistently happening, probably far longer than God expected it to take, but at some point, I finally decided that I was going to get up out of the bed, right? And so I started getting up out of the bed and coming up into this space where at the time was my quote unquote office, but it was also like my space. So it has since transformed into like my prayer room, prayer closet. But I would come up here and I have a chair with an ottoman, and I would sit in this chair and I would plop my feet up and then again, I would cry. And let me just remind you, let me give the disclaimer that this is a judgment-free zone. So don't be out here in these internet streets telling everybody I'm a crybaby, okay? But I would be crying and literally crying out to God, like, God, I'm up here. I don't know why you want me up here, but if you got something to say, please say it, because I just want to go to sleep. I want to hear what you got to say. I want to be obedient, but for real, I'm tired, Lord. And so this started to be my routine, right? I would get up in the morning, or let me rephrase that. God would wake me up in the morning. I would force myself out the bed and up the steps and into this space, and I would cry. And at some point, I'm not going to say suddenly. My pastor used to always say there are no suddenlies, right? But when we're in the midst of a setback, it feels like things happen suddenly. We sometimes lose sight of the fact that we have been crying out and petitioning to God for so long when the change starts to happen. But at some point, I went from crying and begging to go to sleep to being in the presence of God and recognizing once again how to prioritize that peace. And what happened was, in the midst of me understanding that God had something for me when I came into his presence without expectation, I was able to shift my prayers from petitioning and crying and praying for his presence, meaning the presence he could give me. I shifted from praying for God to give me presence to praying to be in God's presence. And so once I started to pray for his presence, I also learned to meditate, right? So I would sit still and I would open up and create the space for God to come in. And then, of course, just as I was doing in the shelter, I would write. I began to write about the things that God was speaking to me, the way that I was feeling, and I started to understand in this season that it was time for me to prioritize purpose. And so what my morning ritual taught me in this season was to prioritize purpose. And what began to happen is that I would come up here, I would pray, I would do my meditation, I would write in my journal, and then guess what? The book that I began to plant the seeds for 10 years earlier on that yellow legal pad when I was in the shelter began to take form. 7 months after my father died, and 10 years to the day that I was shot, I began to write 30 Days Stay. And in fact, because I was prioritizing peace in this season, because my prayers shifted to wanting God's presence and praying to be in his presence, I wrote that book in 30 days at God's speed. Your life will change when you begin to prioritize peace, when you begin to prioritize purpose, and when you recognize that your peace and your purpose have nothing to do with praying for God to give you presents or things or stuff. It's really about being in his presence and living a life as if you always are, living your life as if you always have the peace that surpasses all understanding, because you do. And then not long after I wrote that book, I started to host these monthly gatherings for women called Coffee and Clarity. And I did Coffee and Clarity consistently 1 or 2 times a month. Well, for the first year or so, I did it twice a month. And then for the last year and a half or so, it was once a month. But what happened once I got into my morning ritual, once I got into that space again where I was consistently beginning my day with the presence of God, beginning my day, prioritizing peace, prioritizing my purpose, then God began to speak to me and open up so many other doors that I didn't even know needed to be opened on my bounce back journey. And I want to encourage you right here before I give you the third way, that you When your priorities are aligned with the divine, then you become limitless, right? I'm a firm believer that we lack nothing. Knowing that we lack nothing is what makes us limitless. And that is what makes I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me true for you. When you are so connected, so aligned with the divine that you know you lack nothing, that your missing piece is prioritizing the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. And let me not fool you into thinking that any of this doesn't take work, because it definitely takes work. It takes the active waiting that we talked about in last week's episode. If you missed it, I encourage you to check it out. But in this season, things just began to shift for me at God's speed. So Coffee and Clarity begins. It's consistent. I actually became an award-winning author from writing that book. After 30 days, I became an award-winning entrepreneur because of the work that I was doing with women through Coffee and Clarity. And then the Power Morning was birthed. And oddly enough, the Power Morning was birthed the same way the idea for 30 Day Stay was birthed, the same way the fire was ignited under me to write that book and to start Coffee and Clarity. It started with prayer. And it starts, what I recognize on this bounce back journey is that and again, I talked about this on a previous episode, how breakdowns often precede breakthroughs, right? And if you notice, that's been a theme for me as what I'm sharing. But after Coffee and Clarity was doing great and the book was doing great, and I just felt like something was still missing. And I hadn't been able to really affirm myself in what I was doing, the work that I was doing, because I was still living below what I felt was God's best for my life. And in that regard, I mean that I wasn't generating the income that I felt like I should have been generating. And it was even more frustrating because I felt like I was being obedient. I was aligned with the divine, and still I was on the struggle bus financially, right? And so this is something that God and I would wrestle with consistently. And of course, in true Tiff Huff fashion, I began to cry out to him about that as well. And what he would tell me is what I just shared with you is you lack nothing. Knowing you lack nothing is what makes you limitless. So use what I've given you. And I can distinctly remember sitting there and being like, I've used everything. Like, I've told this story. I've started this community. I'm helping others get into the space where they can get your peace and understand what you had for them and share their stories. And wouldn't you know that it was the transformation that came from my life from sharing from my morning ritual that he would have me to share next. And so I introduced the Power Morning as an opportunity to take Coffee and Clarity to the next level. I'll never forget, I introduced it in the session in July of 2017. And I will be 100% transparent. Like, God literally downloaded all of the Power Morning into me. I created a workbook and the structure, and I had daily lessons and emails, all of the things. And I would be up in my prayer closet and he would just be giving me these downloads, and I was creating all of these things. And then I walked into Coffee and Clarity with the power that I always did. But at the end, when it came time for me to share the opportunity, I was like, oh, and by the way, if anybody's interested, I got this thing that I was thinking you might want to do. And everybody lit up, even though I was so uncertain. And of course, at the time, it was like $1.50 because I just didn't understand what God had given me to bless others. I didn't understand that God had given me something that would bless others and also, be so impactful on my journey and other women's bounce back journey, and that I would be able to, build community, bless women, and yes, make some bank. And it was after that first power morning, in combination with what was happening at Coffee and Clarity, that my morning ritual began to help me shift my perspective about God's power within me and how my power can change the lives of other people. But had I not been willing to be stretched, right? Had I not been obedient to waking up early in the morning, especially in the midst of some of the worst times of my life, where, to be quite honest, there wasn't nothing I would have preferred to do than sleep through all of the pain, right? Than sleep through all of the struggle, because if we aren't in our right state of mind, right? If we aren't prioritizing peace, if we aren't in a place where we're seeking God's presence, we will think that we do need to pray for presence, right? For stuff. And we find ourselves stuck when we don't get that stuff. But because I was in a place where I could prioritize peace, where I was commanding my morning from the first day that I woke up, that I was prioritizing my purpose from the first moment I woke up. And really, prioritizing my purpose really means prioritizing my relationship with God and my relationship with myself by my connection with God. Everything else flowed from there, right? When the Bible says in Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom and everything else will be added unto you, that is what truth became so much more real for me as I became more and more consistent with my morning ritual. And my morning ritual has been a game changer in my life. And so it has it has just infused so much more power into my life and into the lives of everybody else that I come into contact with. And that starts with my children and my husband, and of course, made my relationship with God even that much more powerful. And all of this is part of Cornerstone #1, which, if you haven't listened to it, I encourage you to do so. And so the Power Morning has gone from that POW, obviously, to power. And the acronym for the Power Morning goes as follows. It starts with prayer. And then the O is for opening up or meditation. The W is for writing. And this is free writing. This is journaling, right? The E is for exercise. And the R is for reading. And this is about reading something that is going to feed you spiritually, mentally, professionally. This is not reading like your Facebook feed. Although, if I'm in your Facebook feed, I am feeding you spiritually, I hope. But I want to challenge and encourage you in this season that if you are feeling like there is a missing piece, right? That something is missing for you to have peace. It may be that you need to command your morning and prioritize peace. If you are feeling like there are so many things getting in the way of your purpose, if you've been saying, like I was for 10 years, that you were going to write the book, share the stories, start the blog, and something is missing, it might be that you need to be commanding your morning and prioritizing purpose from the start of the day. If it is that God has clearly given you the key, right, or the tool or the way to bless others, and you just aren't sure, you aren't certain, you don't believe that you can trust him, right? You're lacking that courage to share it with others with the voice of a victor and the posture of power, like we talk about in Cornerstone #2. Then again, I encourage you to command your morning. And if you've been challenged with how to create a powerful morning ritual and you need some support, or you desire to be in community with like-minded women as you begin your bounce back journey, then I want to invite, encourage, and challenge you to join us for the first Power Morning session of 2020. We kick off on Monday, August 3rd. The doors are now open. If you want to speak with me a bit more about what the experience is like and what you can expect, I would love to have a bounce back breakthrough session with you. And you can book that by going to bit.ly/timewithtiff. That link is also in the show notes. And I just want you to know that wherever you are in this season of your bounce back journey, know that I am praying for you and that we don't grow alone, and the Bounce Back Blueprint community ensures that you don't have to. So if you are feeling alone wherever you are on this journey, then you need to grab the link in the show notes and join the Bounce Back Blueprint community, where you can make some covenant connections and just be fed, right? Be challenged, be encouraged, and get even more tips, tools, and tea on your journey from setback to success. I am praying that you were blessed by this week's episode. If you were, then I invite you to share it on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and tag me at the Tiffany Huff. Let me know where you were blessed, how you were blessed. Invite your friends to listen. And of course, don't forget to take a moment or two and leave a review, because when you do, you are being a blessing, not only to me, but to other beacons who are on this bounce back journey. I look forward to connecting with you next week. And of course, remember, sis, God is not going to play you. But if you refuse to command your morning, if you refuse to prioritize your peace and purpose, you're playing yourself. Be blessed.